Asia News.
It was a massacre that almost amounted to genocide. A carefully calculated attempt to kill tens of thousands of Chinese in Singapore during World War II.
There was a deliberate hit list of named individuals, really warped, but very effective.
An estimated 25,000 people eliminated in the space of 2 weeks.
They were put in lorries and cut away and never heard again.
So we can hear the machine gun very fast.
It was only through acts of heroism, personal courage, and in some cases dumb luck, that anyone lived to tell the tale of the Sook Ching massacre. Singapore, December the 8th, 1941. Wealthy plantation owners and the elite of British colonial society danced in the ballroom of the Raffles Hotel. On the other side of the world, Pearl Harbor was reeling from the Japanese bombing that dragged America into the war. But in Singapore, the party went on. Singapore was, after all, an impregnable fortress. The colonial government was so confident that despite the shockwaves sent around the world just hours before, the city lights were on, making it an easy target for the first explosions of Singapore's war. The Japanese bombing raid that came just 9 hours after Pearl Harbor shocked the British out of their complacency. Two days later, they dispatched their only two available battleships, the Prince of Wales and Repulse. Their task was to wreak havoc with Japanese supply and troop ships, to prevent any advance down the Malay Peninsula, where British forces were too thinly spread to be effective. But the fleet was too little and too late. Sent into battle with no air cover, the ships were sitting ducks. The Japanese hit them hard with 85 aircraft attacking in waves. In just 2 hours, the ships were sunk. They carried 840 seamen and British strategy for the defense of the peninsula to a watery grave. With their best hope at the bottom of the ocean, Malaya and Singapore were now wide open to attack.
The Japanese did what the British expected them to do. They attacked southern Thailand and northern Malaya. It's one of those rare instances in military history where everybody on both sides knows what's going to happen. But the British weren't strong enough to prevent the Japanese from moving close enough to Singapore quickly enough to cut it off before really strong reinforcements could arrive.
Speed was the killer. On bicycles, tanks and trucks, the Japanese advanced down through the Malayan Peninsula. In just 55 days, they were on Singapore's doorstep.
British policy for defending Singapore by 1941 was to hope for the best. The war in Europe was going so badly, they were still so worried about defending the home islands against a possible invasion. They were scraping together whatever odds and ends they could possibly to hold out against a Japanese attack for as long as possible.
The British were ill prepared for the turn of events. There was no naval cover, weak air defenses, and their 70,000 troops were already exhausted from the war in Europe. Then, British Commander General Percival made one final fatal mistake. He neglected to strengthen fixed defenses on Singapore's northern coastline. To do so, he thought, would be bad for morale. But even worse for morale were General Yamashita's 80,000 combat troops preparing to storm the island. With little holding them back, the Japanese swarmed across the Straits of Johor, completely overwhelming the thinly spread British and Australian positions. The city of Singapore was there to be taken.
The key to all of this is not that Singapore falls, but how quickly it falls. And it's the mishandling of the defense of Malaya which really does put the nail in the coffin, helps the Japanese to move down so far, so fast, that they get Singapore by the throat.
Desperate, the British put together a local militia of Singapore Chinese called Dalforce. Young, inexperienced, and ill-equipped. What they lacked in training, they made up for in enthusiasm.
Oh yeah, that's the first time I saw a revolver.
They were hopelessly outgunned, and these were Japanese combat veterans with years of experience and well-led, well-equipped. Dalforce was, of course, predictably routed in the field, but they stood their ground.
A cross-section of students and hardcore gangsters. Some were recruited straight from prison, where they had been thrown for their communist leanings. What they shared was a ferocious determination to keep the Japanese out. Others, like Choi Siu-hong, were simply eager to fight.
I was given a revolver. My two friends each were given a rifle, and they were trained a bit of marching and how to use a rifle. And within 2 or 3 days, they were sent from the front. We thought with some help with old rifles, we could we could prevent the Japanese from coming to Singapore. We were wrong, of course.
They were outgunned, they had very little training. All they had was the desperate motivation of defending their families and their homes.
Young Chinese photographer Chiu Kong also wrote his name down on a list of Dalforce volunteers. He was told to report for marksmanship training, but there weren't enough rifles for all 50 recruits. Finally, itching for action, Chiu Kong went to Bukit Timah, where there was rumored to be fighting. 4 others joined him. There were only 2 rifles to be shared among the 5 soldiers.
去到嗰線呢，第一嘅印象啊，就係全地都係死屍，全地死屍，咁樣踩落嘅嘢啊，冧，咁樣我知道嗰場肉搏啊係好劇烈。 非常非常劇烈啊！但係或者已經過咗兩三個鐘頭，可惜我哋遲咗，早啲呢就冇命，早啲一定冇命。
Bukit Timah was a crucial strategic position. In 1942, when it was largely farmland, it became one of the bloodiest battlefields in the fight for Singapore. The poorly equipped men of Dalforce suffered heavy casualties. It was also a prime symbolic spot for the Japanese to raise their flag.
Bukit Timah is the only high ground in the island, and it's in the center of the island, and at its foot were very large supply dumps with a lot of rations and ammunition. So if the Japanese could capture these supply dumps, they would cripple Malaya Command's ability to fight on. And if they could capture the hill, they would get direct observation into the city and be able to pulverize it into submission at will. So it was, both sides recognized, a very strategic position.
As the Japanese closed in on the city, the very fabric of Singapore was being torn apart by the relentless Japanese attacks. By February 1942, with just 24 hours of water supply left in the island's reservoirs, it wouldn't be long before disease broke out. With fuel, food, and ammunition almost gone, there was only one decision left to take. On February the 15th, 1942, the British surrendered. It was a stunning failure of strategy that set the stage for the greatest tragedy in Singapore's history. Left vulnerable to a Japanese army hardened by their time in China, tens of thousands of young Chinese men would soon lose their lives. February 1942. Singapore was under relentless attack by Japanese guns. The British strategy of holding the invading army in the far north of the Malayan Peninsula had failed, and the Japanese had forced their way onto the island by bicycle, tank, and truck. Chinese New Year is the biggest festival for Singapore's Chinese community. But in 1942, the people had neither the time nor the will to celebrate. That year, the festival began on the 15th of February. On that very day, the British were subjected to the ultimate indignity: surrender, after one of the most controversial defeats in England's military history.
The British had failed in the #1 duty of any imperial power, protection. And it was a failure, a visible failure, that they couldn't paper over or sweep under the carpet. This was a political disaster. I mean, the Allies won the Second World War. Losing Singapore didn't change the outcome of the global war. But it did ruin British prestige, and that meant in the long run the end of the British Empire. So it was a big event, definitely, a big political disaster.
General Yamashita, commander of the Japanese army, now faced a problem of his own creation. Japanese bombs had done their work well. The city was in chaos. Authority had broken down and looters were out in full force. As local resistance dissolved, Dalforce volunteer Chu Kong was shocked by the scenes he witnessed in the city.
因為嗰啲撤退咗嗰啲冇着衫啊，冇着衫撤退咗時，我就見到旁有好多嗰啲 ARB 嗰啲帽咧，嗰啲做救傷隊嗰啲睇白都冇啦，個咪除咗掉咗啦啲制服，做乜就掉咗咪就係坑住嗰啲英軍喺嗰時就食嗰啲罐頭嘢啊，飲咗係嘛？ 佢亦都唔好似話開槍，似乎都冇晒指揮官嘅，連指揮嘅人都唔知。
Yamashita needed to restore order and root out anti-Japanese elements, but he didn't trust his own enlisted men. In his diary he wrote, "I want my troops to behave with dignity, but most of them do not seem to have the ability to do so." Yamashita's orders were to bring the city under control, then move his troops on to Indonesia in just 15 days. Fresh from the war in China, they were desensitized, barbaric, and difficult to control. The general needed a fast, precise, and deadly machine. He decided to turn the city over to the Japanese military police, the dreaded Kempeitai, and its leader, Colonel Tsuji Masanobu. Brilliant, vindictive, a fanatical product of his country's arch-militaristic era, Tsuji plotted to rid Singapore of its anti-Japanese elements with sadistic precision. 1937. Newspapers were full of the Japanese invasion of China. As reports of Japanese brutality shocked the world, the anti-Japanese movement in Singapore gained thousands of new adherents, eager to throw themselves behind the cause, both financially and physically. The Chinese resistance in Singapore incensed Japanese nationalist Tsuji Masanobu.
I believe General Yamashita knew exactly how ruthless Tsuji would be, and he obviously knew that the Kempeitai would follow through on everything that Tsuji wanted. Well, because he wanted to ensure that the Chinese community was absolutely subdued. They both had experience of warfare in China. They knew how aggressive the Chinese could be and how they could keep the Japanese at full stretch all the time. So they didn't want guerrilla activity. They wanted a compliant and quiescent population.
Tsuji had planned his operation well in advance.
There was a deliberate hit list of named individuals, and there was an arbitrary list of people in certain categories who were presumed automatically to be irreconcilables without any individual ascertainment. Secret society men, people from Hainan, anyone with spectacles.
But when the Japanese attacks began, there was at least one person in Singapore who greeted the Japanese as liberators. Mamoru Shinozaki was press attaché to the Japanese consulate before the war, but the British had had him arrested and jailed for espionage. With the arrival of war, he fully expected to be shot. But February 15th, 1942, the day the British surrendered, changed history and saved his life. Shinozaki was appointed special advisor to Defense Headquarters, who controlled the Kempeitai. However, like everyone else, he soon learnt that life under his countrymen could be anything but pleasant. Just 3 days after the fall of Singapore, a chilling message was sent out to the Chinese community to report for a mass registration. It was an order they ignored at their peril. The massacre that history would call Sook Ching had just begun. The war that was lost in the jungles of Malaya had now reached Singapore. The British surrendered on the 15th of February 1942. A deadly calm settled over the city as Japanese forces moved in. Just 3 days later, their new masters delivered a chilling message. All Chinese males above the age of 18 must report to detention centers across the island. There were to be no exceptions. Anybody who failed to report by February 21st would be punished. There were 250,000 Chinese men on the island. They obeyed the command, often joined by women and children. They waited, sometimes for several days under the tropical sun, with no food or water, apart from what they brought with them.
The order came from the Japanese that all of us are to go to Torokara English School. All the men were rounded up, and the boys beyond, says 15 or something, they were also rounded up. And we asked to sit in rows in the field and waiting for the Japanese officers to come.
It was round one of the detentions, and the Kempeitai had been given just 5 days to get rid of all potential troublemakers. Their target, 50,000 healthy Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50. At such an impossible pace, the screening was haphazard at best. And these stolen photos are the only images known to have survived those traumatic days.
The records do tend to suggest that the Japanese destroyed a lot of material, and also if you had photographs developed, they had to be approved by the Japanese officials actually, so you don't get too many photographs.
The Kempeitai's first target were the Dalforce volunteers. But their selection process soon became more random. They singled out almost anyone they thought could be anti-Japanese. Suspected communists and China supporters were near the top of the list. Those who made the mistake of writing their names in English were assumed to be pro-British. Those with tattoos were condemned as secret society members. The lucky ones who passed the screening had their bodies or clothes stamped with the Chinese character Jian, or examined. But for thousands, it was their last journey, the start of the now infamous Sook Ching.
When the Japanese office came, there were some, I think, some spies for the Japanese. They started pointing to, they started going around and pointing out persons which they want to stand up. So those are pointed out, they have to stand up. There was one gentleman who was in his 40s, who was a neighbor in the same place, and he was pointed out, and he stood up. So when the Japanese and the spies were not looking, I pulled his shirt, asked him to sit down. So he sat down. And of course, he was not carted away. Those remained standing, they were put in lorries and cut away and never heard again.
Retired army man Major Go Se-fong is one of those who will never know for sure what became of his loved one. He was just 10 years old at the time, and his father was a known supporter of China's wartime leader, Chiang Kai Shek.
He bought a lot of bonds, documents, assisting the Chinese money and hide them on the roof. When the Japanese moved under Sook Ching operation, I don't know how did the Japanese know that he hid something on the roof. Somebody must have informed them. Then the soldiers arrested him, took him away. So we have never see him again.
Particularly sinister policy for Sook Ching was to disappear people. It was psychological, the thinking behind it being if you killed someone and their family knew that you'd killed them, that might drive them to see you as an enemy and seek revenge. Whereas if you disappeared them, they wouldn't know whether they were alive or dead, and therefore they might behave themselves and sit quietly at home and not resist you or cause you any trouble. So it was a very calculated policy to round these people up but then take them away and to massacre them out of sight of the civilian population so that question mark would hang over the community. Maybe, just maybe, if we sit quietly and behave ourselves, maybe they'll let our fathers and brothers come home one day. Very effective, devastatingly so. Really warped, but very effective.
It was not until the 1960s that the fate of the disappeared ones became clear. From 1962 to 1966, construction in this area, now ironically the home of Japanese-owned factories, uncovered a deadly secret. Work was interrupted for 4 years to allow a massive exhumation of thousands of human remains. The area was aptly dubbed the Valley of Death. The whispers, rumors, and allegations of the war years were finally confirmed. Another 35 mass graves would eventually be uncovered all across Singapore. Personal effects recovered from the sites were donated to the National History Museum. They revealed an even more disturbing truth.
We see here women's watches. They're quite elegant, and obviously these women are quite wealthy. And next to them, we have women's earrings, which have jewels in them. But the most worrying thing is the presence of children's jewelry, the anklets and bangles. Children's anklets are usually for toddlers. Okay, so that tells us more or less that women took their children to these centers, and the women were also sent away and executed. This is contrary to what we know from the stories that have been told to us about the women and children being sent home and the men being screened and massacred.
Among the effects was a wallet embossed with the name of a doctor whose remains and family have never been identified. Like many who lived in the eastern suburb of Katong, he would have gone for screening at one of the largest detention centers, the old Telok Kurau English School on Singapore's east coast. Here on 22nd of February, just 7 days after the surrender of Singapore, some 1,600 stunned residents streamed in to be screened. After days of processing, the unlucky ones were loaded onto trucks and taken away. Their journey took them through the sleepy kampong of Sigla, a farming village near the beach. Local Malay resident Muhammad Anis bin Tarin was just a boy then, but he remembers vividly what happened next.
Pada ketika itu, semua kawasan sudah dikepung, sudah dikawal ketat oleh tentera Jepun. Tidak ada orang yang boleh masuk, tidak ada yang boleh keluar. Kalau siapa berani, berhati matilah. And then we can see from far only. And when you can smile, wah, apa bau itu? Mean all the blood shed. Also we can hear the machine gun very fast. Stop. Again and again and again.
Now home to one of Singapore's top schools, this place was once a killing field.
Oh, ini di tempat dulunya bukit. Sana dusun buah-buahan. Sini sudah masuk kebun sayur. Dan tempat yang inilah orang-orang yang diberi kerja. Dibawa berjalan, masuk ke tempat kawasan ni. Sampai di dalam sana, mereka kena gali lubang. Dah gali lubang panjang. Kemudian mereka beratur, terus mereka tembak pakai machine gun. Sebentar dalam pukul 9 hingga pukul 11, bunyi machine gun tidak berhenti-henti membunuh apa saja seberapa cepat. Jadi bila dia timbus, tutup, kelam kabut, mau cepat, maka ada yang tak sempat ditanam. Mana-mana yang lari, kawasan itu dibakar. Pondok-pondok dibakar. Kandang-kandang babi dibakar. Semua di mana yang dipikir ada yang bergerak, di tempat itu dibakar.
Japanese spy turned defense advisor Mamoru Shinozaki was horrified by what was happening. He used his new position to issue special protection passes to diplomatic staff and citizens of neutral countries. But it wasn't long before Chinese civilians came to him for help. His definition of diplomat became very loose, and he gave away as many as 30,000 passes to any and all who came.
I did not view the people as my enemy. I didn't care. Anybody who came to see me, I gave. In the night, I would print many cards. Name and age, I would leave blank for them to fill in themselves. Chopped and chopped. I prepared a few thousand every night. Next day, they would all be finished.
A veteran of the armed forces, Major Roland Simon, was just one of those whose young life was touched by Shinozaki. One fateful day, it was his father's turn to report to a Sook center for screening. His father had been a medical corps volunteer who took medicine to Japanese prisoners in Changi before the surrender. One of those prisoners was Mamoru Shinozaki.
Mr. Shinozaki remembered that. You see? So when he went to report in this center, Shinozaki was there. And he saw, he said, "Simon, come here." He went there, wrote something in Japanese, and there's a big chop there. So you go home. I know where you're living. I want you to do something for me later on. So he took that. As he passed the sentry, he stopped him, he showed this letter. The sentry bowed at him. He was surprised. So he came back. He said, "I got this letter, even the sentry bowed at me."
But even Shinozaki could not completely stop the slaughter. And for some, it was only their quick thinking that saved them. Chu Kong had signed up for Dalforce, the militia which inflicted heavy casualties on the invading Japanese army. Fortunately for Chu Kong, most organizations had burnt their anti-Japanese documents, so the Japanese had no idea of Chu Kong's resistance. But that wasn't enough to get him out of this camp.
入到去呢，仲坐地下，你哋嗰啲人喺個時啊，佢叫晒上嚟啦，一擺或者20-30人咁樣叫晒上嚟啦。佢睇過晒之後咧，叫呢2-3個過嚟呢邊，咁樣啊喺嗰個坑渠邊處啊有好多嗰啲羅哩嘅，唔知佢咁樣咧就做得出。 唔知點樣煮法呢，就上邊價錢。
Chu Kong's instinct told him that the lorry was not the place he wanted to be.
廿幾歲嗰啲咧，嗰啲身體好好嗰啲咧，係嘛？嗰啲一定係抗日軍啊！嗰啲有家庭嘅40零歲嗰啲咧，嗰啲一定係好人咧。佢即係咁樣想法。咁嗰陣時我知道呢排實死啊！咁樣我睇白自己想個辦法嚟逃生得嘅。咁啱啱我嗰時亦有個兩公婆有3個細路哥，一個喊得好緊要，咁我忽然之間我就拍住一個，我就講話上去佢大家都冇講住話，即係嗰個日本兵上嚟㗎，睇下我，好似話我係有家庭嘅，有細路哥，唔出聲，俾我出。
At defense headquarters, Shinozaki realized that things were getting out of hand. He had intervened personally on behalf of many Chinese in the detention centers. He had also issued thousands of good citizen cards, stamped and signed with his name. But the cards alone could not stop the massacre. With tens of thousands being rounded up, he needed a new plan and someone to help him put it into action before it was too late. Round 1 of the Sook massacre was over. But as the Japanese got more organized, their targets began to change. It was getting harder and harder to slip through their net, and the next phase was just about to begin. Not content with targeting just ordinary people, the Japanese now hunted down the leaders of the Chinese community. Top of their list were the hundreds of prominent Chinese businessmen suspected of organizing donations for the China war effort. Lim Boon Keng was one of the founders of the China Relief Fund, dedicated to supporting China's war effort against Japan. He was also a member of the Legislative Council, marking him as pro-British. As a prominent community leader, he was a possible head of future resistance against the Japanese. If ever there was a man more unsuited for the new regime, it was Lim Boon Keng. The Japanese didn't need an excuse to kill anyone, but they got one when they raided Lim Boon Keng's home. They found a letter signed by Chiang Kai Shek himself, thanking Lim Boon Keng for his help in the war against the Japanese.
The young corporal brought Dr. Lim Boon Keng to my place. He was so proud over his catch.
But Lim Boon Keng had had the good fortune to stumble upon Shinozaki, the Japanese official who would do all he could to stop the killing spree. Shinozaki suggested that the Chinese set up an organization to act as a buffer between their community and the Japanese. Through them, the Japanese would be able to control the Chinese population more easily. But long hours of negotiation would be needed to persuade Lim Boon Keng that this was not some kind of trap. Meanwhile, at the detention centers, the selection process carried on relentlessly. The Japanese were determined to weed out any potential opposition to Japanese rule. The position of the British-trained former police force was especially precarious.
Of course, they're targeted because they've been cooperating with the Japanese enemy, which was the British Empire. But the Japanese were able to turn some of the detectives, a lot of them actually, so that they were agents of the Sook Ching. Some of the worst massacres, like the massacre at Siglap, was actually aided and abetted by Chinese detectives without the urging of the Japanese officer in command.
Detective Kang Tian Huat of the Criminal Investigation Department was one of those who knew he was in trouble. Detective Kang spent 7 days in a detention center. When finally they began releasing people, he attempted to leave. But it wasn't to be that easy. Some of the guards had hooded informants helping them. As Detective Kang tried to leave, one of them recognized him as a police officer. They grabbed him by the coat and dragged him back in. Because he had supplied a false name to the Japanese, he was severely beaten. All the other prisoners were tied in groups of 3 or 4. But because of his injuries, the guards didn't bother to do the same with him. He was thrown onto the back of a truck. The truck drove through the streets of Singapore to Changi Beach. Detective Kang knew they weren't going there for a swim. Changi Beach today is a serene playground for weekend beachgoers, most of them blissfully unaware of the grim events that took place here in 1942. With so many disappearing in isolated execution spots, scattered and left with no known graves, there was no opportunity for relatives to grieve or honor their memory with the appropriate rituals.
If you die a violent death in Chinese culture, it's believed that you'll just become a hungry ghost, which means that you're locked in this kind of limbo hell or whatever, and you must somehow escape from this to go onto the next world. So they had no bodies to lay offerings and to pray to. You need the body in terms of the tomb. You need all this stuff to actually have proper closure and to make sure that there isn't this hungry ghost that your relative has been made into.
The anxiety of the victims' families reached crisis point in 1948, when rumors spread across the island of ghostly wails issuing from unmarked graves.
Apabila sudah kejadian ini, maka selalu tempat-tempat ini kata orang angker. Angker main keras, banyak hantu. Ada orang nampak, kepala saja berjalan, badan tak ada. Ada orang nampak, badan saja tak ada kepala. Orang menangis, orang minta tolong, orang menjerit-jerit. Selalu dapat didengar.
Thousands of relatives attended a 3-day gathering at the Siglap massacre site. Ritual donations of food, paper clothing and paper money were offered to calm the spirits of the dead and send them on their final journey to the afterlife. As tens of thousands of those victims were being led to their deaths, Shinozaki was still having a difficult time persuading Lim Boon Keng to lead a Chinese organization that would cooperate with the Japanese. Shinozaki felt that this was the only way they could finally stop the massacre.
At first he kept saying he could not do it. But I said that Japanese army headquarters were very, very angry, that the Chinese volunteers from Dalforce fought against them. That was why the Japanese staff officers wanted to kill all Chinese people here, especially those who had donated to China. He said, that means all of us will be killed.
Finally, Lim Boon Keng agreed. That, however, was the easy part. Shinozaki now had to persuade his superiors in the Kempeitai that it was time to stop the massacre. He requested that all the influential Chinese arrested be released, so that they could join Lim Boon Keng's new organization. This show of goodwill would encourage all Chinese to join, and they would be easier for the Japanese to control.
His face looked very angry. I was very worried that he would not understand. But then his face changed, and he said, yeah, we should take them out. I will also discuss this with the defense commander that we take action to release them.
Lim Boon Keng drew up a list of 300 influential Chinese leaders who'd been imprisoned. Shinozaki was able to obtain their release just before they were sent to the beaches. Tsuji's plan to leave the Chinese community leaderless had failed at the last minute. Finally, after 16 days, the massacre was over. The Japanese army were ordered to move on with their assault on the rest of Southeast Asia. The haphazard way in which the Sook Ching was conducted resulted in the deaths of many innocents. But the same haphazard operations also allowed the bold, the clever, and the plain lucky to escape with their lives. Tsuji returned to Japan, a hero. An estimated 25,000 to 50,000 Chinese had been killed, but the true figure will never be known. The killing spree known as the Sook Ching massacre was over after 16 murderous days. In what almost amounted to a planned genocide, up to 50,000 of Singapore's Chinese population had been wiped out, then buried in mass graves in isolated areas around the island. At Changi Beach, Kang Tian Huat, the detective betrayed by his colleagues, watched in horror as dozens of young men were gunned down. By a lucky coincidence, he was not tied up, and he knew that this was his last chance of survival. He made a desperate dash for freedom. Detective Kang is one of the very few who are known to have survived the killing spree. He returned as an eyewitness to a community traumatized.
I think the evidence we have suggests that as late as the end of the war, many people were clinging to the hope that their loved ones were still alive. And I can understand that. Unless and until you get definitive proof that your loved one is dead, you cling to the hope that somehow, some way, they survived. So it really wasn't until after the war and the British military tribunals' legal investigation teams began investigating the massacres for war crimes trials that the definitive evidence began to filter out and the community began to accept that, yes, they were never coming back.
The discovery of human remains in the 1960s prompted a massive rally of the Chinese community. 120,000 people, many survivors of the Sook Ching screenings, gathered to demand both compensation from Japan and the building of a memorial for those who perished.
In the early post-war period, there was a desire amongst the Chinese community to exact revenge, to get payment for the blood debt in terms of making the Japanese pay for what they'd done. So the focus was on vengeance. And then that gradually moved to the rituals of commemoration and memorialization. And then over a long period, there was a desire to rebury the victims with the proper rituals, the proper Chinese rituals that needed to be done to assuage the spirits.
In 1967, 662 large funeral urns, full of skeletal remains, were placed under Singapore's new civilian war memorial. Today, the Sook Ching massacre has become a quiet chapter in Singapore's history. The sites of many of the mass graves have been forgotten, buried by the city's rapid growth.
This place is very pretty and very beautiful, but it does mask, a kind of dark side. If you look at that road, you'll see that a lot of Chinese villages used to be along that area. The Chinese were perceived by the Japanese soldiers as giving information to the British. So they just went through the whole area and killed the Chinese as retaliation.
Kevin Blackburn has taken on the task of reminding a new generation of young history teachers what lies just below the surface.
Given the scale of atrocity and the extent of brutality that the local people experienced during the war, it is surprising that many of the experiences are largely forgotten. There are a few ideas about why that's happened. One is the wartime experience was very divisive. You have the Chinese experience, which emphasizes the massacres, and then you have the Malay experience, which talks about nationalism, and then the Indian experience talks about nationalism. So you have all these communities, instead of being united as Singaporeans, they're divided according to their ethnic lines.
But for those who lived through those years, the memories may be dimmed, but not forgotten. Each year, on the 15th of February, the remains of the victims that lie below Singapore's Civilian War Memorial are honored in a moving ceremony. It provides a focus for the families who still grieve for loved ones taken away from them so suddenly during the war.
This one is for my father. This one for my uncle.
For the nation as a whole, it unites Singapore's diverse communities in remembering all those civilians who suffered under Japanese occupation.
I think some of the Chinese would not have forgiven them. Although they trade with them, they talk to them and entertain them as business people, but some of them, the older generation, would not have forgotten what happened.
These are the things that we try to forget. It's very hard to forget, but I've forgiven them.
We can forgive, but not forget.